December 27, 2016. The cardiac unit at UCLA Medical Center falls silent as the monitors flatline. Carrie Fisher, 60, the woman who had fought Darth Vader on screen and battled her own demons off-screen, takes her final breath. In her bloodstream, toxicology reports will later reveal flows a cocktail of cocaine, heroin, and MDMA, the chemical evidence of a war she had been fighting her entire adult life. But this is not just any death. This is the end of Princess Leia, the most iconic female character in science fiction history. This is the silencing of a voice that had spoken with brutal honesty about mental illness, addiction, and the dark side of Hollywood glamour. This is the final chapter of a woman who had turned her pain into art and her trauma into comedy gold. The irony is devastating. The actress who gave hope to rebels across the galaxy died on a flight from London to Los Angeles, her heart stopping at 30,000 feet above the very world she had spent decades trying to escape. The woman who had written, "I Want It" reported that I drowned in moonlight, strangled by my own bra as a darkly comic prediction of her own demise, instead succumbed to the more mundane tragedy of cardiac arrest brought on by decades of self-medication. But here's the question that haunts everyone who loved Carrie Fisher. Was her death the inevitable conclusion of a life spent battling invisible enemies? Or was it the final casualty of an industry that chews up its stars and spits out their bones? The truth lies buried beneath layers of Hollywood mythology, prescription bottles, and the brilliant wit that she used to deflect attention from her deepest wounds. To understand how Princess Leia died alone on an airplane, we must first understand how Carrie Fisher learned that being someone's daughter, someone's princess, someone's fantasy could never be enough to save you from yourself. But the force was strong with this one, even if that force was sometimes destructive rather than protective. October 21st, 1956. Beverly Hills, California. In a mansion where show tunes echo through marble hallways and gossip columnists lurk behind every perfectly manicured hedge, Frances Carrie Fisher draws her first breath into the rarefied air of Hollywood royalty. Her first audience consists of her mother, Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart fresh from Singin' in the Rain, and her father, Eddie Fisher, whose voice can make Bobby Soxers swoon from coast to coast. But even in this fairy tale beginning, the cracks are already showing. Eddie's eyes wander to other women the way a moth seeks flame, while Debbie maintains her public smile even as her private world crumbles. Baby Carrie absorbs it all, the performance, the pretense, the devastating gap between public image and private reality. The Beverly Hills of the 1950s is a place where dysfunction wears diamonds and despair drives luxury cars. Carrie grows up understanding that her parents are not just Eddie and Debbie, but Eddie and Debbie trademark, branded commodities whose personal lives exist primarily to service their professional images. Love, she learns early, is something that happens in movies, not necessarily in the marriages that create those movies. At 3 years old, she's already performing for the cameras that seem to follow her family everywhere. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, casual afternoons by the pool. Nothing in the Fisher-Reynolds household happens without the possibility of public consumption. Carrie learns to smile on command, to be charming for strangers, to understand that her value lies not in who she is, but in how well she can embody who others want her to be. The divorce, when it comes in 1959, plays out like a Shakespearean tragedy adapted for the gossip pages. Eddie leaves Debbie for Elizabeth Taylor, not just any woman, but Debbie's best friend, the most beautiful woman in the world, the woman who makes headlines just by breathing. The betrayal is so complete, so publicly humiliating, that it becomes one of Hollywood's most legendary scandals. 3-year-old Carrie watches her world explode in flashbulbs and front-page headlines. She sees her mother's forced smile at press conferences, hears the whispered conversations that stop when she enters rooms, feels the weight of being the child of Hollywood's most famous broken marriage. The lesson sinks deep. Love is temporary. Loyalty is conditional, and happiness is something you perform for others rather than something you feel for yourself. Debbie, devastated but determined to survive, throws herself into work with the manic energy of someone trying to outrun heartbreak. She becomes both mother and father to Carrie and her younger brother Todd, while simultaneously maintaining a career that requires her to be perpetually cheerful for public consumption. The children learn to compete with their mother's career for attention, a competition they frequently lose. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? For Carrie, the answer is written in the contradictions of her upbringing. She learned to be funny because humor was the only acceptable way to express pain in her household. She learned to be tough because vulnerability was a luxury her family couldn't afford. She learned to be brilliant because intelligence was the only currency that couldn't be taken away by unfaithful husbands or fickle audiences. But she also learned that love comes with conditions, that families exist primarily for public relations purposes, and that the gap between who you are and who you're supposed to be can become so wide that you lose yourself in the space between. The seeds of her future struggles, with relationships, with identity, with the chemical substances that promise to bridge unbridgeable gaps, are planted in the soil of a childhood where authenticity was always sacrificed to image. As Carrie enters adolescence, she's already displaying the sharp wit and brutal honesty that will define her adult voice. But she's also showing the first signs of the mood swings and emotional intensity that will later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. In a family where mental health is never discussed and perfection is the only acceptable public face, these early symptoms are dismissed as adolescent drama or artistic temperament. The stage is set for everything that follows: the princess who will save the galaxy but can't save herself, the writer who will expose Hollywood's hypocrisies while remaining trapped by them, the woman who will spend her life turning pain into punchlines while the pain slowly kills her. Beverly Hills High School buzzes with the kind of teenage drama that only happens when the children of the famous are forced to pretend they're normal. 17-year-old Carrie Fisher stands out even in this crowd of industry offspring, not just because of her famous parents, but because of her razor-sharp wit and her refusal to play by the unspoken rules of Hollywood nepotism. While her classmates are experimenting with typical teenage rebellion, Carrie is already living an adult life that most people twice her age would find overwhelming. She's dropped out of high school to pursue acting, studying at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London, where she discovers that her American celebrity means nothing to British theater instructors who care more about craft than connections. But London also introduces her to something that will haunt her for the rest of her life: drugs. In the permissive atmosphere of 1970s London, cocaine and pills are as common as tea and biscuits for a teenager already struggling with undiagnosed bipolar disorder. These substances offer temporary relief from the emotional extremes that have plagued her since childhood. They also plant the seeds of an addiction that will shadow every achievement for the next 4 decades. Her early acting work is competent but unremarkable. Small parts in forgettable films, the kind of roles that ambitious young actresses take while waiting for their real career to begin. But Carrie is already showing the intelligence and observational skills that will make her a brilliant writer. She watches everything, remembers everyone, and files away the absurdities and hypocrisies she witnesses for future use. The entertainment industry of the mid-1970s is a particularly toxic environment for young women. The feminist movement is just beginning to challenge Hollywood's traditional power structures. But the actual changes are minimal. Women are still expected to be beautiful first, talented second, and compliant always. For someone with Carrie's intelligence and independence, this creates constant friction with directors, producers, and agents who want her to be more grateful, more accommodating, more like the fantasy they're selling to audiences. Her relationship with her mother during this period is complicated by their shared profession. Debbie Reynolds is still a major star, but she's also a woman of the 1950s trying to understand a daughter who embodies the rebellious spirit of the 1970s. They love each other fiercely, but they also compete in ways that neither fully acknowledges. For attention, for relevance, for the right to define what it means to be a woman in entertainment. The call that changes everything comes in 1976. George Lucas, a young director known mainly for American Graffiti, is casting a space fantasy that everyone assumes will be a modest success at best. The role of Princess Leia requires someone who can be beautiful enough to be a fairy tale princess, but tough enough to lead a rebellion. Carrie's audition tape reveals something that the other actresses lack. She delivers the ridiculous dialogue with complete conviction while also suggesting that the character is smarter than everyone around her. When she gets the part, Carrie assumes she's signing up for a fun science fiction romp that might boost her career modestly. She has no idea that she's about to become one of the most recognizable women on the planet, or that Princess Leia will become both her greatest professional achievement and her most inescapable burden. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? For Carrie, this question will define the rest of her life. Princess Leia will make her rich, famous, and culturally immortal. But Leia will also become a prison from which she can never fully escape. A character so beloved by millions that Carrie Fisher, the person, will often feel like an afterthought to her own life. The woman who steps onto the Star Wars set in 1976 is smart, funny, and ambitious. The woman who emerges from the global phenomenon that follows will be transformed in ways both wonderful and terrible. She's about to learn that being everyone's princess can be the loneliest job in the galaxy. The sound stages at Elstree Studios outside London are buzzing with the controlled chaos of a major film production. But this isn't just any movie. This is Star Wars, and although no one involved quite realizes it yet, they're creating a cultural earthquake that will reshape popular entertainment for generations. Carrie Fisher, 20 years old and determined to prove herself as more than just another Hollywood legacy, arrives on set with her hair in elaborate braids and her mouth full of dialogue that sounds like it was written by someone who learned English from a philosophy textbook. "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope." The words feel ridiculous in her mouth, but she delivers them with the same conviction she would bring to Shakespeare. The character of Princess Leia is revolutionary in ways that won't be fully appreciated until decades later. Unlike the passive damsels in distress that dominated science fiction, Leia is a leader, a warrior, a woman who rescues herself as often as she needs rescuing. She's beautiful but not helpless, royal but not spoiled, feminine but not weak. In creating Leia, George Lucas and Carrie Fisher are reinventing what it means to be a heroine in popular culture. But behind the scenes, Carrie is discovering the less glamorous realities of movie stardom. The famous cinnamon buns hairstyle takes hours to create each morning and gives her constant headaches. The white dress that looks ethereal on screen is actually uncomfortable and impractical. The sets are freezing. The dialogue is often incomprehensible, and she's working with actors who seem as bewildered by the whole experience as she is. The romance that develops between Carrie and Harrison Ford during filming is the kind of secret that Hollywood legends are built on. Ford is 13 years older, devastatingly charming, and married. Everything that should make him off limits to a young actress trying to be taken seriously. But the chemistry between them is undeniable, both on screen and off, and the affair that follows will remain one of the entertainment industry's best-kept secrets for decades. Carrie's journals from this period, which she'll later publish as The Princess Diarist, reveal a young woman struggling with the gap between her public image and private reality. She's playing a princess on screen while feeling like a fraud in her own life. She's becoming famous for embodying strength and leadership while battling inner demons that she doesn't yet understand or have names for. When Star Wars is released in May 1977, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Lines stretch around city blocks. The film breaks box office records almost daily. And suddenly, everyone involved finds themselves at the center of a cultural phenomenon unlike anything anyone has ever experienced. Carrie Fisher goes to bed one night as a struggling young actress and wakes up the next morning as Princess Leia, a character who will be more famous and beloved than she ever dreamed of being herself. The success should be pure joy, but for Carrie it comes with complications that no one prepared her for. She can't walk down the street without being recognized, can't go on a date without paparazzi following, can't make any professional choice without considering how it will affect the Star Wars brand. She's achieved every actor's dream of iconic stardom, but the icon is threatening to consume the person who created it. The fan mail that floods her agent's office reveals the depth of Leia's cultural impact. Little girls write to thank her for showing them that princesses can be warriors. Teenage boys confess their romantic fantasies. Adult women credit her with inspiring them to be stronger in their own lives. The character has touched something fundamental in the collective imagination, but that means Carrie herself can never be just a person again. She's become a symbol. And symbols don't get to have bad days or make mistakes or struggle with personal problems. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The answer for Carrie is becoming increasingly obvious. She's surrounded by more people than ever before, but most of them want to meet Princess Leia, not Carrie Fisher. She's more financially secure than she's ever been, but money can't fill the void left by the absence of authentic relationships. She's professionally successful beyond her wildest dreams. But professional success feels hollow when it's built on a character rather than her own talents and personality. The drinking and drug use that began in London escalates as the pressures of fame intensify. Cocaine helps her maintain the energy required for endless promotional appearances. Pills help her sleep despite the anxiety that fame brings. Alcohol helps her socialize at industry events where she's always on display. What begins as recreational use gradually becomes self-medication for problems she doesn't yet have names for. As 1977 draws to a close, Carrie Fisher stands at a crossroads she doesn't yet recognize. The next chapter of her life will involve 2 more Star Wars films, increasing struggles with substance abuse, the emergence of her bipolar disorder, and the beginning of her transformation from actress to writer. She's about to learn that being a princess is just the beginning of her story, not the end of it. The late 1970s and early 1980s should be the best years of Carrie Fisher's life. The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi cement her status as a cultural icon, while her growing confidence as a performer allows her to bring new depths to Princess Leia. But behind the success, the darker currents of her life are growing stronger and more difficult to ignore. The famous slave bikini scene in Return of the Jedi becomes a defining moment that Carrie will spend decades trying to contextualize. On one hand, the sequence shows Leia at her most resourceful and deadly, using her captor's underestimation of her to engineer her own rescue and his demise. On the other hand, it reduces one of cinema's most empowered female characters to a sexual fantasy for male audiences. The contradiction perfectly captures Carrie's complex relationship with her own fame, empowered and exploited simultaneously. During this period, her bipolar disorder begins to manifest more clearly, though it won't be properly diagnosed for several more years. The extreme mood swings that she had attributed to artistic temperament or family dysfunction are becoming more severe and more disruptive. Manic episodes fuel creative bursts and social brilliance, but they're followed by depressive crashes that leave her unable to function for days at a time. The entertainment industry of the early 1980s has no framework for understanding or accommodating mental illness. Actors are expected to be on whenever they're in public to maintain their image regardless of their internal state, to treat any personal problems as weaknesses that must be hidden from view. For someone with Carrie's condition, this creates an impossible situation. She must perform normalcy even when normalcy is literally impossible for her brain to achieve. Her cocaine use escalates from recreational to habitual to necessary. The drug helps regulate her mood swings, providing artificial energy during depressive episodes and artificial calm during manic ones. What she doesn't understand is that cocaine is actually making her bipolar symptoms worse, creating a cycle where she needs more drugs to manage the problems caused by the drugs she's already taking. The relationships in her life become casualties of her increasing instability. The affair with Harrison Ford ends badly, leaving her with emotional wounds that take years to heal. Other romantic relationships follow similar patterns, initial attraction based partly on her fame, followed by increasing difficulties as her mental health problems become apparent, followed by breakups that leave her feeling more isolated and damaged than before. Her friendship with other actors from the Star Wars films becomes complicated by the different ways they handle fame. Mark Hamill embraces his identity as Luke Skywalker and builds a successful career in voice acting. Harrison Ford leverages his Star Wars success into even bigger movie stardom. But Carrie finds herself typecast and struggling to establish an identity beyond Princess Leia. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? For Carrie, the success of Star Wars isn't a single tragic event, but rather the beginning of a long struggle to maintain her sense of self while living up to the expectations created by her most famous role. Her attempts to branch out into other types of acting meet with mixed results. She's talented enough to handle dramatic material, but audiences have difficulty accepting her as anyone other than Leia. Casting directors see her as either a science fiction actress or a celebrity curiosity, not as a serious performer capable of complex roles. The pressure to maintain her public image while dealing with private struggles becomes increasingly exhausting. Every public appearance requires careful management of her mood and energy levels. Every interview involves questions about Star Wars, Harrison Ford, and her famous mother, leaving little room to discuss her own interests or ambitions. She's becoming expert at deflecting personal questions with humor, but the humor is becoming more caustic and desperate. Her relationship with Debbie Reynolds during this period is both a source of support and additional pressure. Debbie is proud of her daughter's success but worried about the changes she sees in Carrie's behavior and appearance. Their conversations become delicate negotiations between concern and privacy, love and professional boundaries. The financial rewards of Star Wars success provide security but also create new forms of pressure. Carrie finds herself supporting not just her own lifestyle but also various family members and friends who expect her to be generous with her newfound wealth. The money becomes another burden, rather than the freedom it was supposed to represent. As the 1980s progress, Carrie begins to understand that her real talent may lie not in acting but in writing. She starts keeping detailed journals about her experiences in Hollywood, her struggles with mental illness, and her observations about the entertainment industry. The writing becomes a form of therapy, a way to process experiences that are too complex and painful to discuss in interviews or casual conversations. The transformation from actress to writer won't happen overnight, but the groundwork is being laid during these difficult years. Carrie is learning to turn her pain into material, her dysfunction into comedy, her insider knowledge into social criticism. The woman who will eventually write some of Hollywood's most incisive commentary on fame, addiction, and mental illness is emerging from the wreckage of the woman who just wanted to be a successful actress. The Sunset Strip buzzes with the artificial energy of cocaine and ambition. But inside the cramped apartment she's renting while trying to rebuild her life, Carrie Fisher sits at a typewriter that has become her lifeline. The pages scattered around her contain something unprecedented, a novel that turns the brutal realities of Hollywood addiction into dark comedy, written by someone who has lived every devastating detail firsthand. Postcards from the Edge emerges from Carrie's typewriter like a confession wrapped in wit. The story of an actress struggling with drug addiction while navigating a complicated relationship with her famous mother isn't technically autobiographical. But everyone who knows Carrie recognizes the truth behind the fiction. She's found a way to tell her story without quite telling her story, to expose Hollywood's hypocrisies while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid lawsuits. The writing process itself becomes a form of recovery. For someone whose brain chemistry makes emotional regulation nearly impossible, the act of transforming chaos into narrative provides a structure that medication and therapy haven't been able to achieve. Every painful memory becomes potential material. Every humiliating episode becomes a possible punchline. Every moment of despair becomes raw material for transformation into something that might help other people feel less alone. But the success of the book creates new problems even as it solves old ones. Hollywood loves redemption narratives, especially ones that can be adapted into profitable films. Suddenly, everyone wants to work with the new Carrie Fisher, the brilliant writer who can turn dysfunction into gold. But they still want her to be just functional enough to be profitable, not so honest that she makes them uncomfortable. The film adaptation of Postcards from the Edge starring Meryl Streep becomes a critical and commercial success, but it also crystallizes Carrie's complicated relationship with her own story. Watching Streep perform a version of her life is surreal and somehow diminishing, as if her actual experiences are less valid than a movie star's interpretation of them. She's successful, but in a way that still feels like she's being erased in favor of a more palatable version of herself. Her work as a script doctor during this period reveals another dimension of her talent. Studios begin hiring her to fix other people's screenplays, to add wit and emotional reality to projects that feel artificial or forced. She becomes one of Hollywood's most sought-after uncredited writers, improving films like Hook, Sister Act, and The Wedding Singer with dialogue that sounds like actual human conversation rather than movie speak. The script doctor work appeals to her because it allows her to use her intelligence and observational skills without having to be the public face of the projects. She can fix problems and earn good money and remain relatively invisible, a refreshing change from the constant scrutiny that comes with being Princess Leia. But it also reinforces her sense of being more valuable for her labor than for her identity, more useful behind the scenes than in the spotlight. Her romantic life during this period is marked by a brief but intense relationship with Paul Simon, the legendary singer-songwriter who seems as troubled and brilliant as she is. Their marriage in 1983 lasts less than a year, but the connection they share, two artists struggling with fame, mental health, and the challenge of creating authentic work in an inauthentic industry, runs deeper than their ability to live together successfully. Simon later writes songs about their relationship that capture both its intensity and its impossibility. For Carrie, the marriage represents another attempt to find someone who understands the peculiar challenges of being famous for your talent, while struggling to maintain your sanity. The failure of the relationship reinforces her growing belief that romantic love might be incompatible with the life she's chosen or been chosen by. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Carrie, the answer is becoming increasingly clear. Escape isn't the goal, transformation is. She's learning to use her darkness as raw material rather than trying to eliminate it, to mine her dysfunction for comedy rather than hiding it in shame. Her bipolar disorder is finally properly diagnosed during this period, providing both relief and new challenges. The relief comes from finally having a name for the extreme mood swings that have plagued her since adolescence. The challenges come from learning to manage a condition that affects every aspect of her life, from her work schedule to her relationships to her creative process. The medications that help stabilize her mood also affect her creativity in ways that are sometimes problematic. The manic episodes that fuel her best writing become less frequent and less intense, but they also become less accessible as sources of creative energy. She has to learn to write from a more stable place, which requires developing new creative muscles and accepting that controlled creativity might be less spectacular but more sustainable than chaos-driven inspiration. As the 1980s draw to a close, Carrie Fisher has successfully reinvented herself from actress to writer, from Hollywood princess to Hollywood truth-teller. But the transformation comes with its own set of pressures and expectations. Now she's not just responsible for being Princess Leia. She's also responsible for being the funny, brilliant, brutally honest voice of Hollywood dysfunction. The performance continues, but at least now it's a performance that feels more authentic to who she actually is. The 1990s marked Carrie Fisher's evolution from Hollywood insider to Hollywood critic, from someone who participates in the industry's mythology to someone who exposes its mechanics. Her writing becomes sharper, her public appearances more candid, and her reputation as someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths becomes both an asset and a liability in an industry built on comfortable lies. Her second novel, Surrender the Pink, explores the aftermath of divorce with the same brutal honesty she brought to addiction in her first book. But it's her nonfiction writing and public speaking that truly establish her as a unique voice in American culture. She begins giving talks about mental illness and addiction that are unlike anything audiences have heard before. Raw, funny, educational, and completely without self-pity, the public speaking engagements reveal another facet of her talent. On stage, discussing her struggles with bipolar disorder and drug addiction, Carrie transforms personal pain into universal comedy without minimizing the genuine suffering involved. She makes audiences laugh about electroshock therapy, about hallucinations, about the absurdities of Hollywood recovery culture. But she never makes the underlying problem seem trivial or easy to solve. Her relationship with Star Wars during this period becomes increasingly complex. The original trilogy has achieved classic status, making her financially secure through residuals and merchandising deals, but it also means she can never escape the shadow of Princess Leia. Every interview, every public appearance, every new project gets filtered through her most famous role. She learns to embrace the financial benefits while maintaining a healthy skepticism about the cultural worship of fictional characters. The fan conventions and autograph sessions that become increasingly common during this decade provide Carrie with a unique perspective on her own fame. She meets thousands of people for whom Princess Leia represents something profound: strength, hope, rebellion against authority. Proof that women can be heroes too. These encounters help her understand that her ambivalence about the role doesn't diminish its genuine impact on other people's lives. Her battles with studio executives over merchandising and licensing deals reveal another side of her intelligence. Carrie becomes an expert on the business aspects of entertainment, understanding contracts, royalties, and brand management in ways that many actors never bother to learn. She fights for fair compensation not just for herself but for other actors who have created culturally significant characters without receiving appropriate ongoing benefits. The development of her one-woman show, Wishful Drinking, represents the culmination of her evolution from performer to truth-teller. The show, which she'll eventually perform on Broadway and adapt into a book and HBO special, is part memoir, part comedy routine, part mental health advocacy, and part Hollywood exposé. It's the work of someone who has learned to weaponize vulnerability, to use confession as a form of connection rather than humiliation. In Wishful Drinking, Carrie perfects the technique of making audiences laugh at genuinely tragic material without minimizing the tragedy. She tells stories about her father's abandonment, her mother's neediness, her own addiction and mental illness, the surreal absurdities of Star Wars fame, and the general dysfunction of Hollywood families with a timing and perspective that makes it all somehow bearable and even redemptive. Her writing during this period also includes script doctoring work that helps shape some of the decade's most successful films. Her uncredited contributions to romantic comedies and action movies demonstrate her understanding of how to make dialogue sound natural, how to develop character relationships that feel authentic, and how to inject humor that enhances rather than undermines dramatic moments. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? For Carrie, the decision to become increasingly public about her private struggles represents a form of courage that most celebrities never attempt. She's choosing transparency over image management, honesty over brand protection, genuine connection over artificial admiration. Her relationship with her daughter Billie, born in 1992, adds new dimensions to her understanding of family, fame, and responsibility. She's determined not to repeat the patterns of emotional unavailability and public performance that marked her own childhood. But she also has to figure out how to be a present mother while managing bipolar disorder, maintaining a career, and dealing with the constant demands of being a public figure. The challenge of raising a child while living with mental illness becomes another source of material for her writing and speaking. She's candid about the difficulties involved, the times when depression makes her emotionally unavailable, the way medication affects her energy and mood, the complexity of explaining mental illness to a child who needs stability and consistency. As the millennium approaches, Carrie Fisher has established herself as something unique in American culture. A celebrity who refuses to perform happiness, a writer who turns dysfunction into art, a mental health advocate who uses humor to make difficult topics accessible, and a woman who has learned to survive by telling the truth about survival itself. The new millennium brings unexpected challenges and opportunities for Carrie Fisher. At 44, she's too old for leading lady roles but too young to be dismissed as a relic of the past. The entertainment industry is changing rapidly. New technologies, new distribution methods, new attitudes toward mental health and addiction. And Carrie finds herself uniquely positioned to comment on these changes as both insider and outsider. The return to the Star Wars universe with the prequel trilogy creates complicated feelings for Carrie. She's not part of the new films, which gives her the freedom to be critical of their reception while also making her feel somewhat displaced from the franchise that defined her career. Watching younger actors step into the universe she helped create brings up questions about legacy, relevance, and what it means to be associated with something that has outlived your active participation in it. Her writing during this period becomes even more personal and politically engaged. She publishes The Best Awful There Is, a novel that continues her exploration of mental illness and Hollywood dysfunction, but with a harder edge that reflects her growing impatience with the industry's superficiality and her society's stigmatization of mental health issues. The 2008 financial crisis affects Carrie differently than it affects most celebrities. Her income has never been entirely dependent on acting roles. The combination of Star Wars residuals, script doctoring work, book sales, and speaking fees provides multiple revenue streams that offer some protection from economic downturns. But she also becomes more aware of how precarious most people's lives are, and this awareness infuses her public advocacy work with increased urgency. Her Broadway run of Wishful Drinking in 2009 represents a professional triumph that validates her evolution from actress to performer-writer-advocate. The show receives positive reviews and strong ticket sales, but more importantly, it establishes her as someone who can command a stage with nothing but her own story, her own wit, and her own hard-won wisdom. The critical success proves that audiences are hungry for the kind of unflinching honesty that most entertainment avoids. The book version of Wishful Drinking becomes a bestseller, reaching audiences who might never see the stage show but are drawn to her particular blend of memoir and social commentary. The success of the book leads to more speaking engagements, more writing opportunities, and more invitations to comment on mental health issues in mainstream media. Her advocacy work expands during this period to include more formal involvement with mental health organizations. She becomes a spokesperson for various bipolar awareness campaigns, participates in congressional hearings about mental health funding, and uses her platform to push for better insurance coverage for mental health treatment. The work feels like a natural extension of her writing and speaking, but it also represents a more explicit commitment to using her fame for purposes beyond entertainment. Her relationship with Harrison Ford, dormant for decades, resurfaces in a new form when they're both cast in Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Working together again after more than 30 years provides an opportunity to revisit and recontextualize their complicated history. They're both different people now. Older, more experienced, carrying different kinds of damage and wisdom. The decision to return to Star Wars for the sequel trilogy isn't made lightly. At 59, Carrie understands that reprising Princess Leia will likely define the final act of her career in public life. She negotiates for creative input, insisting that Leia's character development reflect the passage of time and the accumulation of experience that comes with age. She wants to play a woman, not try to recreate the young princess she had been 4 decades earlier. The filming of The Force Awakens becomes an exercise in reconciling past and present. She's working with the same character but bringing decades of additional life experience to the role. The Leia who emerges is recognizably the same person but transformed by time, loss, and responsibility in ways that mirror Carrie's own evolution. Her final book, The Princess Diarist, published just weeks before her death, represents the culmination of her lifelong project of turning personal experience into public art. The book reveals her affair with Harrison Ford during the filming of the original Star Wars, but it does so with the perspective of someone who has spent 40 years thinking about fame, love, memory, and the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives. The book tour for The Princess Diarist becomes her final public performance, a series of appearances where she discusses love, aging, mental illness, and the strange experience of being remembered primarily for work you did as a young person. She's funny, insightful, and brutally honest, but those close to her notice signs of the exhaustion and physical decline that will contribute to her death just weeks later. December 23rd, 2016. British Airways Flight 5 from London to Los Angeles cruises at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. In Seat 2A, Carrie Fisher sits surrounded by the detritus of a promotional tour that has taken her across 2 continents in less than 2 weeks. Her latest book, The Princess Diarist, rests on the tray table beside medications that represent 4 decades of managing bipolar disorder, chronic pain, and the various other conditions that accumulate when you've lived hard and long in the public eye. The flight attendants recognize her, of course. Everyone recognizes her. At 60, she still carries the unmistakable presence of Princess Leia, though now it's layered with the accumulated weight of everything she's experienced since those long-ago days on the Star Wars sets. She's polite but tired, declining the champagne offered in first class, focusing instead on the medications that keep her functioning through the grueling schedule of book promotion. What happens next will never be fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. Sometime during the flight, Carrie's heart begins to struggle. The autopsy will later reveal the presence of cocaine, heroin, and MDMA in her system. Drugs that suggest a level of desperation and self-medication that contradicts the public image of a woman who had seemed to have found peace with her demons. The cardiac arrest that follows isn't dramatic like a movie death. There's no final speech, no last words that sum up a life's meaning, no peaceful fading away surrounded by loved ones. Instead, there's just the medical emergency that unfolds at 30,000 feet above the ocean, with strangers performing CPR while the plane diverts to Los Angeles International Airport, and an ambulance waits on the tarmac. She lingers for 4 days at UCLA Medical Center, long enough for family and friends to gather, for the media to set up outside the hospital, for the world to hold its collective breath, hoping for another of the recoveries that had defined her adult life. But the damage is too extensive this time, the heart too weakened by decades of chemical abuse and genetic predisposition, the body finally unable to sustain the brilliant mind that had used it as raw material for so many years. When the news of her death breaks on December 27th, the response is immediate and global. Social media fills with tributes from fans, fellow actors, politicians, and mental health advocates who had been inspired by her courage in discussing bipolar disorder and addiction. The headlines write themselves. Princess Leia dies. Carrie Fisher, 60 dead. Star Wars icon passes away. But the tributes that matter most come from the people whose lives she had touched through her honesty about mental illness. The suicide hotlines report increased calls from people struggling with their own demons. People who had found hope in her example of someone who lived openly with bipolar disorder, who turned pain into art, who refused to be ashamed of her struggles. The toxicology report released months later sparks the predictable debates about celebrity drug use, personal responsibility, and the relationship between mental illness and addiction. Some people express disappointment that she hadn't conquered her demons. Others argue that her death proves the ongoing danger of stigmatizing mental health treatment. But those who understood her work know that Carrie Fisher never claimed to have conquered anything. Her message had always been about survival, not victory. About finding ways to keep going despite the brain chemistry that made ordinary happiness nearly impossible. About using creativity and humor to transform suffering into something that might help other people feel less alone. Her memorial service becomes a celebration of a life that refused to be sanitized for public consumption. The eulogies are funny, honest, and complicated, just like the woman they're honoring. Harrison Ford speaks about their complicated relationship. Meryl Streep performs a musical number. Her daughter Billie gives a speech that captures both the difficulty and the privilege of being raised by someone who turned their dysfunction into art. The day after Carrie's memorial service, Debbie Reynolds dies of a stroke. As if she couldn't survive the loss of her daughter. The timing seems almost too poetic to be real, the mother following the daughter into death. Two women whose relationship had been complicated by fame, mental illness, and the pressures of performing happiness for public consumption. Their joint funeral becomes a Hollywood spectacle that neither woman would have entirely approved of, but both would have understood. The entertainment industry loves tragedy, especially tragedy that can be packaged as inspiration. But the real legacy of Carrie Fisher can't be packaged or simplified or turned into easy lessons about overcoming adversity. Her legacy lies in the permission she gave other people to be imperfect, to struggle openly, to use their pain as raw material for connection rather than hiding it in shame. Every person who has spoken honestly about mental illness, every artist who has turned dysfunction into creativity, Every individual who has refused to pretend that their life is more perfect than it actually is. All of them are building on the foundation that Carrie Fisher established by insisting on telling the truth about what it means to be human. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind their public image? For Carrie, the most profound secret was hidden in plain sight, that behind all the wit and wisdom and brutal honesty was a woman who had never quite figured out how to be happy, who had spent her entire adult life looking for a way to make peace with a brain that seemed determined to destroy her. She succeeded in turning that struggle into art, into advocacy, into a form of connection that transcended the usual boundaries between celebrity and audience. But the cost was her life, paid out over decades in the currency of pain transformed into punchlines, of suffering alchemized into stories that made other people feel less alone. Take your broken heart and make it into art, she had advised. She followed her own advice until the very end, creating beauty from brokenness right up until the moment when the heart, both literal and metaphorical, finally stopped working altogether. The force was strong with this one, but sometimes even the force isn't enough to save you from yourself. Princess Leia saved the galaxy, but Carrie Fisher couldn't save Carrie Fisher. And perhaps that's the most honest ending possible for someone who spent her life insisting that happy endings are mostly fiction, but that the attempt to create them, in art, in love, in the daily struggle to keep going, is what makes us human.